Today, we're honored to welcome Dr. Anil Bajnath to the show today. I'm very excited to have him on. We're going to talk about everything longevity, right? And we talk about so many things on the show, and longevity is really so important because we talk about lifespan, but what is health span, right? And this fits right in there. So, not just about living, but how can we live life to our years? This man has an amazing story and a lot of expertise within this. And today, we're going to walk away with practical takeaways to implement in our own lives and be empowered at every conversation. So, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I'm very curious to hear your story, how you got to wellness, longevity, and how you're being of service today.
That's a great question. Thank you again. My story kind of begins as a teenager, working for, the nutraceutical industry at a Whole Foods market. And when I was 16 years old and got exposed to the whole world of nutraceuticals, herbals, homeopathics, and kind of worked my way up the ladder and getting further training in dark field phase contrast microscopy, analyzing blood, nutritional applications, double majored in molecular microbiology, medical laboratory science, started studying with the Europeans and this whole model of German new medicine, went to med school, came back, did, residency in family medicine, while also doing some additional training in medical acupuncture at the University of Miami, clinical homeopathy with CEDH, botanical medicine with the ABC, American Botanical Council, and putting it all together in my integrative hybridized practice. When I finished res, I was also qualified and trained with the Institute for Functional Medicine. Finished my certification there, anti-aging and regenerative medicine with A4M, faculty at GW where I teach integrative and. Yeah, and then this my private practice kind of led me to teaching at the university, kind of a proof of concept of what I do clinically with some of the classes I teach with connecting the molecular dots of multi-omic profiling. What's what I do with my patients, and then that gave rise to me being founding the American Board of Precision Medicine, where I really feel as though that the future of healthcare is kind of connecting those molecular dots from genome to phenome, advancing, leveraging advanced molecular diagnostics and therapeutics, highly curated to the individual.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So it sounds like you got into longevity, and there's so many different facets within that, right? It sounds like there's so many different things. It's kind of like a very curious thing to explore, right? And there's so many avenues to be of service within that. And speaking of longevity, like how would you define that exactly? Like, what does that mean to people, and how can we start to kind of think about that in our own lives?
So, it's interesting because longevity is like, I think, the end result of, mitigating the biological aging process. So I like to frame things with the threats to longevity, which is essentially aging, right? And things that hyper accelerate the biological aging process. And I think that, when it comes down to it, I'm not too sure if your audience is familiar with the 12 hallmarks of aging, but, there are 12 well established scientific molecular mechanisms behind the biological aging process. And each one has its own little crazy dynamic and potential therapeutic intervention, diagnostic, proxies, and basically, is what mediates most disease processes or pathophysiology towards a disease. And like, for example, diabetes has multiple different hallmarks of aging that influences that phenotype. Um, so with that being said, I think it's important to put things in the context of, what are the threats to longevity, which is the biological aging process. Longevity is just such a buzz term that I think a lot of people are using right now to try to maybe sell you something, right? I hate to say it, but there's a lot of charlatans and noise and things out there that I don't think are scientifically validated and appropriately used in a clinical context. But that's a whole nother conversation. So when it comes down to it, I would also put things in the context of what the World Health Organization classifies as the somebody's intrinsic capacity. And intrinsic capacity is a universally accepted term for looking at quantifying some of the surrogate endpoints of longevity. That looks at like psychomotor health and just overall mental status, vitality, and overall well-being. So there's 5 core domains that are associated with that. And to me, that is like a quantification of health span. So arguably, longevity could be further characterized as a reflection of health span. And, health span is the time of existence that is unencumbered by any disease or dysfunction. And there are other, ways of quantifying these different metrics, engaging that biological aging trajectory and process, which ultimately, kind of culminates into, this end result of longevity. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, definitely. So speaking of aging, like what really causes that exactly? Like what does that even mean? And like what are some environmental factors, lifestyle things that go into that exactly?
So again, back to the 12 hallmarks of aging, hallmark number one being basically genetic instability. There's all these different environmental toxicants that we're exposed to on a regular basis that could bioaccumulate in our system and actually lead to DNA damage, right? If we don't have a high degree of DNA proofreading repair enzyme activity, that damage kind of copy forwards and leads to, bad DNA. And that bad DNA, whether it's insertions, deletions, or also known as indels, mutations, those things could lead to basically a weakened DNA structure that could ultimately lead to, unfortunately, accelerated aging or even cancer. So the hallmarks that drive aging in regards to genetic instability are the same hallmarks that drive cancer development. So, and to the point of what you mentioned with, what are these environmental factors that are triggering this? It's everything, right? So in my practice, we measure everything. We measure genome to phenome, and we essentially connect those molecular dots. And one of their greatest threats are these different environmental toxicants that we're exposed to on a regular basis that could bioaccumulate in our system due to that environmental genetic mismatch. And as this stuff accumulates in our tissues in our system due to impaired detoxification pathways or just the chronicity of exposure or, multiple different mechanisms that, are there, it basically could lead to essentially this bioaccumulation of toxicity that leads to damage, that leads to, impaired function. And that could be anything. That could be heavy metals. It could be phthalates, parabens from your cosmetic products. It could be organophosphates from inorganic foods or pesticides, herbicides, fungicides from the golf course. It could be PFAS, these forever chemicals with your cooking utensils. It could be microplastics from like everything, right? So when I go through and I start measuring some of the stuff in your system, you see all these environmental toxicants that are, essentially in concentrations high enough that are measurable due to the chronicity of exposure that is leading it to be in your system. So with that being said, that I do think that, being environmentally conscious is one of the greater opportunities that we have to identify, mitigate, and eliminate those threats environmentally to your longevity as a whole. I hope that.
Awesome. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I feel like that speaks to empowerment, right? Because a lot of us we think these things happen, there's nothing we can do, right? But we can actually do these things gracefully, and we're not just a victim to these things. We can actually take the actions in our own hands. And when we start to think like that, then our actions are going to proceed in that manner, right? Because I feel like we just get old and we just kind of like, we have this typical thing in our mind where we're just like injured, we can't do anything. And it doesn't have to be like that, it sounds like.
No, it doesn't. And I think it just comes down to, really health conscious decisions, in regards to being aware of what's you're being exposed to, what you're consuming, what your physical level of activity is, your quality of sleep, meaning and purpose, relationships, social connections, and all of that's very important, right? It is within our locus of control. And then as far as, some of these emerging technologies that are out there, I do think that there's some very interesting evidence around, whether it's therapeutic plasma exchange to go in there and, pull out all the bad stuff from your system using a blood filtration mechanism that's been shown to reverse reverse biological age. I think, there's a really interesting study out of Tel Aviv that looked at hyperbaric oxygen therapy at improving telomerase activity, which is one of the hallmarks of aging, has been shown to enhance, telomere function. So, and then, there's like the TRIM trial that looked at, growth hormone and vitamin D and metformin and zinc and a few other agents that have been shown to help reverse biological age. And that's a whole nother conversation with the targeted therapeutic interventions that could be used with evidence to leverage clinically to help support, somebody throughout their, season of life wherever they might be. So there's very interesting tools, technologies, and therapies that are out there that could be used to help enhance that whole lifespan, health span narrative.
Awesome. So if people are listening in, like, what are some actions we can take today based off on our lifestyle? And after we do that, like, how do we know if we should go for certain therapies that can perhaps help us with our current condition or based off our current goals? Like, where do we start if we just want to start to take action in our own day-to-day lives?
I think it's I call in my book that's coming out the longevity equation right there, right? I make reference to this concept of what is called biological 401k, right? We have our own health savings account for which we're making daily deposits, withdrawals to, in forms of epigenetic currency, and that could be diet, exercise, sleep, nutrition, meaning and purpose, social connections. All those things need to be dialed in. And ultimately, it's when we start losing that regulatory adaptive capacity in those different domains that we start seeing a decline in our ability to deal with stress and those factors. So I do think that we can make daily deposits and withdrawals in our biological 401k in those different bioregulatory domains in order to enhance our resiliency and adaptive capacity. So yeah, I don't really think it's a crazy secret, but how do we dial in our sleep, right? If you're obese and overweight or thick neck and you snore, get a sleep study. Make sure that's dialed in, and making sure that there's no hypoxic episodes, because that's one of the greatest drivers towards cardiometabolic and heart disease as a whole, right? Exercise, push yourself, right? Always strive to do better, lift more or lift better, strive for and enhancing that VO2 max and endurance, whatever it is, meaning and purpose. Always have that, very important. Social connections, right? Relationships, dial those in every day. We can work on adding 1% of improvement to each one of those different domains, so that cumulatively over a year, things are improved as a whole, right? So you're bigger, better than you were earlier in the year. So those are all very important strategies I think that we could implement on a regular basis. I know it sounds super generic and basic, but if we start becoming more cognizant of the foods that we're eating and our protein intake to, help facilitate muscle protein synthesis, we cut out the seed oils, we cut out all the, processed crap in our system, all these little things, and that's just on a dietetic nutritional side. I mentioned sleep. All right, maybe we start looking at how do we biohack our sleep, maximizing melatonin production and being able to enhance growth hormone production, avoiding alcohol before we go in, temperature, environmental factors, the timing of exercise to sleep. All those little things kind of influence our sleep quality and viability. And I think that's very important also to address another hallmark of aging, which is misfolded proteins. So if we're not dialing in our sleep, and every day we're missing 1 to 2 hours of sleep, 2 to 3 hours of sleep, those are missed opportunities for our lymphatic system to work at nighttime to wash away the misfolded proteins accumulating in our neurons, right? And it's amazing what happens when you have that glass 2 or 3 of wine, on the weekend or whenever it is, and how that impairs your body's ability to get restorative recovery and sleep. So I think, it's really like dissecting all these different segments and being able to put together a comprehensive framework to identify and optimize those different bioregulatory domains.
Awesome. Yeah. I love that analogy, right? Because every single day we have opportunities to kind of withdraw from that bank account, or we can add to it, and we can do that based off our own decisions, right? It's so empowering, as we know that, and there's so much like adaptability within there, and it sounds like we have to focus on more than just one thing, right? So we talk about nutrition, obviously, but then sleep, right? Are we moving? Stress management, all these things, they work in synergy together. And once we have all these like in place, I feel like we're going to feel a lot better in our lives.
That's it. That's it. Stress is the number one factor, though, I think. I think, there was I saw it somewhere on social media, but basically, asking AI to, you know, identify, the greatest, tool that we could use to improve our health span and our longevity. And it wasn't necessarily all the crazy things that people think, it's not the fancy drugs, medications, it's not the crazy diets, but it's actually how do we deal with and process stress. And I can tell you firsthand that is one of the greatest threats, that I've experienced is just, having gone through the medical training and the industrial complex associated with that and all the different things associated with that, that stress is a main driver, I think, of how our adaptive capacity to deal with, our longitudinal potential for longevity. So I do think that identifying and addressing that stress, and there's different proxies we could look at beyond how do you feel? Right. Heart rate variability is, I think, a very important, surrogate marker that could be used that you could capture on a regular and daily basis to understand how your body is dealing with stress and processing it as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you also mentioned purpose and social connectivity, right? I feel like that's so important, just being able to be connected with our purpose, right? Living a life of integrity and honor and all these different things, right? Because I feel like the mind is ultimately the foundation of how we make our decisions. And being able to connect with people around us is so important. And just being able to have that top of mind so we can take these actions and be aware of these things is so key.
I agree. Social connection is very important because we are not meant to be in isolation. One of the greatest stressors is being in isolation. Like, look at solitary confinement. It's like the greatest punishment that somebody could receive institutionally, right? And so being away from others and not having those meaningful connections, I think is, it hurts the soul. So when it comes down to it, you want to make sure that your tribe is aligned, right? And that you feel heard, validated, and you're able to exchange meaning and purpose, shared enhance ideas across that tribe. So I think connection is very important because, whether it's from team sports or, from the gym or from, different activities that you're involved with professionally, all those things I think really fuel your regenerative capacity through social meaning and purpose.
Yeah, I mean, because what we're doing is really strengthen our capacity to withstand things, right? Whatever it is, whether it's stress, challenges, anything in our lives, because things are going to happen, right? And if we're not fortified in all areas of our lives, we're going to be much more susceptible to uh, folding, I guess. Like we're not going to be as resilient and in the face of adversity, right? So having this capacity, it kind of extends to everything in our lives.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Is how do we feed that bucket? I can tell you right now, I've got two small kids at home. Sleep is challenged. And so for me right now, I my adaptive capacity is going down because of my, of this season of life with two young kids. But it's okay. I do think that that's where you build up the reserve and you're always making meaningful deposits into that account so that you have that buffer, so to speak, when you're running on fumes, just like an athlete, endurance fighter, if you're looking like a UFC fighter or a jujitsu guy, is how do you every day, making deposits into your body's resiliency as a fighter. You're, focusing on a clean diet. You're focusing on endurance. You're focusing on recovery and sleep. All those things are going to help, make meaningful contribution into your athletic performance and ability to execute under fire. And it's the cumulative effects. And you've seen it in maybe some of the championship fights that are on TV, when fighters are really digging deep and they're, at their wits' end and they're somehow pull out last minute, a crazy submission or a crazy knockout. It's all of that hard work and effort and discipline that went into the preparation of fight camp, that's going to allow them to be able to perform at max, championship level. And it's everything. It's those cumulative efforts, right? It's the discipline behind that's going to allow for maximized performance.
Yeah, I mean, just saying like we don't rise to the occasion, we fall in love with our training, right? And I
Mhm.
feel like we can rise to it, but ultimately, we have to stay ready, so we have to get ready, right? So we're actually staying on top of our habits, we're doing all these things, so we can live an optimal life, right? And as opposed to like doing the average thing, which is like we're not really on top of things, we're kind of unaware, and we wonder why we're not getting results we want. So being aware of these things is so important.
I agree. And I think honestly, instead of doctor-patient relationship, we should have coach-athlete relationship. That's how it should be treated because we're all potential athletes, right? And, if you were to look at my favorite patients are my athletes. Why? Because they're so dialed in. Everything is so disciplined. You said, hey, based on your VO2 max testing, we need to adjust your macros for your goals of performance around your endurance sports or your, whatever the competition might be. That is what makes a huge difference because they're going to deploy and execute, these recommendations with precision and, being able to identify your macros, identify your recovery. Are you overtraining? Are you, dialed in with the right supplements? Are you, all these little things need to be taken into account and build on that foundation. And then it's like also, how do we leverage the recovery technologies, whether it's, intermittent hypoxic hyperoxic therapy or, EWOT, exercising with oxygen, or HBOT, hyperbaric oxygen. All these different technologies are very important for performance, longevity, and everything else. So if we shift the narrative away from, disease and everything towards, hey, how do we treat everybody should treat themselves as an athlete? How do we, basically get us dialed in, waking up every morning with the appropriate discipline needed to at least, treat our body as a garden and a machine, right? Get on the floor and stretch first thing in the morning, say your affirmations and prayers, practice your gratitude, get the right, morning routine dialed in with, whatever it might be, cold plunge, lemon in the water, all these salt in the water, all these little things that you would do to make meaningful, deposits in your daily account so that you could face the day primed and ready to go with full, readiness to just, you know, be 110%.
Yeah,
Trying not to curse here. You know?
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because doctor, that means teacher, right? And being able to educate these things and have that relationship of like, I feel like the number one thing you can do ultimately is be the model, right? Be the model in life for what is possible. And we do that by actually practicing the things that we're talking about. And then you have like more authority in a sense, like more experience to actually like, hey, this actually works. And now you kind of like guide people to their own answers in a sense.
Yeah, that's right. So "docere" means in Latin to teach, and that also means doctor. And I think, it's very important to, identify who you're dealing with and their kind of personality type and where they're at in life, because everybody is in different stages and phases and seasons of where they're at, and, you gotta match them where they're at and try to reverse engineer and psychoanalyze, any mindset restrictions and limitations, self-limiting beliefs, and try to work through that so that again we could optimize and maximize our human potential towards 110% abundance and ability to tap into that next state and phase, whether it's the high performing CEO that's making $100 million deals, the attorney that is dealing with crazy cases, or most of my patients or a lot of my patients are doctors. I'm like the doctor's doctor because most physicians really appreciate and understand the comprehensive evaluation that I do clinically to connect those molecular dots. So it's just knowing who your audience is and trying to adapt to them and identify their stress points and their pain points so that they could break through and get to the next level.
100%. Yeah. Because like when we actually start to implement these things and build momentum with all these practices, it's like you just feel like it's so much better than the alternative, right? And you just kind of want to do it more and build all these practices. So, so key. I mean, I kind of want to touch on purpose a little bit more, like in like relationships. How can we start to get connected to that just a little bit? Like, if we're kind of like confused, how do we get more in synergy and alignment with what is real in our own lives?
I think it just really depends on the individual and their dynamic. You mentioned relationships. I'm not a relationship counselor, coach, or anything. I'm probably the worst person to speak to with that. But, your partner needs to be the right person. If your partner is not dialed in and supporting you 110% to your fullest capacity, and we all know, we've all been there, right? Where you try to make things work with somebody that there wasn't that resonance, that natural alignment. You got to cut the cord. So I think who you align with, who you share your life with, needs to be truly oscillating on multiple levels and frequencies bioenergetically on the same level. If not, you're just gonna be running your head through the wall every friggin' day, right? And well, transactional relationships are also really not good. There's a lot of people that are just together because of um, convenience and transactions and economic dynamics. Um, dare I say, look at you know our current president and his wife. I don't know, man. And not talk shit, but like that seems very transactional to me. I don't think there's a lot of love and connection there. So for what it's worth, you want to make sure that you're aligned with somebody that's going to make you grow and thrive and enjoy taking your trips and doing fun, adventurous things. So when it comes down to the relationship side, I think it's you got to make sure you got the right one. I don't know if
Yeah,
there's one or multiple, who knows?
yeah, some great points there. In terms of longevity therapies, are you excited about anything that's coming up? Like anything that people should be aware of, or would kind of benefit most people to think about in a sense?
I think, there's strong evidence behind intermittent fasting. 18.6, is the magic number published in New England Journal of Medicine. I think it was in 21. And, 18.6 being 18, hours of fasting, 6-hour feeding window. And, I also would say there's strong evidence around that because it activates a very important cellular recycling mechanism called autophagy. And autophagy is going to go in there and pull out all the bad stuff, right? All the old damaged organelles. Those organelles, if they bioaccumulate, it's going to slow down our machine, our operating capacity to perform at the highest level. So I do believe that intermittent fasting is a great tool that we have access to, that we could be practicing on a regular basis. Historically used to be caloric restriction. I think there's strong evidence. There's a calorie trial that's coming out that's looked at the reversal of biological age, based on caloric restriction. So the combination of caloric restriction, intermittent fasting, I think has tremendous therapeutic potential at activating, very specific and targeted signaling pathways that have tremendous anti-aging potential. Additionally, I really, building on that intermittent fasting, I think there's this concept of senolytic therapy. Senolytics refers to drugs and medications that target senescent cells. Senescent cells, also known as zombie cells, are these age cells that are locked into a state of G1 cell cycle arrest that are still metabolically active and spewing out these inflammatory signals and proteins known as SASP, senescent associated secretory phenotype. That phenotype is very interesting because it basically accelerates a biological aging process. So there's theories and clinical applications out there when you are doing the intermittent fasting, caloric restriction, maybe even low carb, slightly keto, and doing, even just full on fast, hitting the person with a level of a senolytic stack in a what's called a hit and run fashion. It's all in the literature, whether it's dasatinib, quercetin, fisetin, or cynomorphic agents like rapamycin. They all have therapeutic potential, but again, it's using it in the right context in the right order and making sure that, the person is suitable for this type of therapy. I could get into some of the research behind it, but essentially I do think that those are like some of the fun things when it comes down to, cellular rejuvenation, pulling out the bad, replacing the new. And then that prepares the body for, I think, regenerative medicine, stem cells, exosomes, PRP, whatever it might be, even certain peptides, right? So it's knowing where somebody's at, working through the process, dialing in all the things that are missing, replacing what's missing, making sure hormones are based online. I love hormone replacement therapy for the right people at the right time, at the right dose. I don't think you need to be juiced to the gills and walking around with, as a 70-year-old with hormones of a 20-year-old. But I do think that dialing that in and optimizing it is part of the therapeutic order of getting somebody to be dialed in, optimized, and then, putting in some of the other therapies, layering the other therapies on top of that.
100%. So it sounds like we should probably, get the basics down first before we get those next level therapies in a sense, because also work better as well.
That's right. So yeah, there's, I think, a therapeutic order that makes mechanistic and biochemical sense on how to approach this type of, medicine. And again, I've been studying this stuff for over 25 years. And for me personally, it's not a interest, but a passion. And, in my office here, we're doing all of it. We're doing the advanced diagnostics, therapeutics, and technologies. We have the hyperbaric oxygen, whole body photobiomodulation, pulse electromagnetic field. I see patients all over the country. I'm licensed in almost all 50, and have the ability to kind of support them wherever they are, through this process. So, it's never too late to start. It's very important to build a strong foundation. My book kind of covers all that stuff because, for whatever reason you're unable to see me, I try my best to lay out the molecular framework of what I think the future diagnostics are in clinical care. And I also lay out some of the more advanced technologies. I get into the senolytics. I get into some of the peptides. Yeah, so I think all those have a role and relevancy in somebody's, equation.
All right. I love it. Thanks so much. Dr. Bajnath, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you so much today for coming on the show, sharing your story with us and all your insights on longevity and how important it is in our own day-to-day lives to take control of these things, right? Because it sounds like the actions are really in our hands to actually age gracefully and also live a life of, you know, optimum reality in a sense, like to become the greatest versions of ourselves and make our dreams a reality, right? Because we can focus on everything, like health, wealth, relationships, and taking control of these things. Getting connected with our purpose is so key. And we uncovered so many insights to take control today. And basically, if you take action on some things and apply these, you're going to see the results, right? And it's not just knowledge is power. Knowledge applied is power and wisdom. So just take actions on small things and see results in your lives today. So thank you so much today, and it's been an honor.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
So if people want to get connected with you and your work, where can we find you?
Oh, yeah. If you were to just Google my name, you'll see all the different projects that I'm involved with. For doctors, physicians out there, they could, look into the American Board of Precision Medicine. For patients that are interested in working with me, they could find me at the Institute for Human Optimization. That's ifho.org. And yeah, just I'm over on social media and everything else. So they can just find me. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you.